The Silent Observer. Premise: after overhearing his wife's affair with their neighbor, the husband doesn't confront her. Instead, he installs hidden cameras around the house, catching her in the act multiple times. He sends anonymous clips to the neighbor's wife, who ends the affair and divorces her husband. Twist: with her lover gone, the cheating wife spirals into guilt and confusion, only to find out her husband orchestrated everything, including the lover's downfall. Equals 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 equals. Friday evenings had always been my favorite time of the week. After grinding through long days at work, I'd come home to the comfort of our suburban house, crack open a beer, and feel a sliver of peace. That night was no different, or so I thought. I walked into the kitchen to grab a drink, anticipating another quiet night in, but then I heard it. At first it was faint, muffled by the thin walls that separated our house from the neighbors. A soft laugh, low and intimate, floated over. I paused, thinking maybe the Hendersons were watching TV. But when I caught the timbre of a man's voice followed by Rebecca's unmistakable laugh, something inside me shifted. The laugh wasn't the usual polite chuckle she gave our friends or coworkers at a party. This was different. It carried a warmth and familiarity that I hadn't heard in years, not from her, and certainly not directed at me. "Don't worry about him," Rebecca said, her voice muted but clear enough to freeze me mid-step. "He's so oblivious. Always working late or fixing something. He doesn't have a clue." I didn't need to hear more to feel the blood drain from my face. My wife, my Rebecca, was talking to someone else. About me. The man's voice responded, but I couldn't make out his words. It didn't matter. I leaned against the counter, my beer untouched, my pulse pounding in my ears as my mind began connecting dots I hadn't noticed before. Or maybe I had, but refused to acknowledge. Her new gym routine, which suddenly required 2-hour sessions 3 nights a week. The way she'd started dressing up more, even for simple errands. Her phone, practically glued to her hand, always face down when she set it on the counter. The texts she received late at night, her soft smile as she glanced at them before sliding her phone back into her pocket. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was confirmation. My wife was cheating on me. And it wasn't with a stranger, it was with Dan, our neighbor. I should have stormed over right then. I should have confronted them, demanded answers. But instead I stayed rooted to the spot. A part of me wasn't ready to hear her admit it. Another part of me, the rational, calculating side, wanted proof. I couldn't just accuse her without evidence. And so, I stayed quiet. That night, Rebecca came home later than usual. She slipped into bed beside me, her hair slightly damp from a shower. She didn't say much, just murmured a tired "good night" before turning away, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of the truth settle on my chest. Memories of our 12 years together flashed through my mind, the laughter, the arguments, the quiet moments on the couch after the kids had gone to bed. It all felt distant now, like a life that belonged to someone else. I wanted to ask her about the cologne lingering faintly on her skin, the kind I didn't recognize. I wanted to grab her phone and demand she unlock it. But I didn't. Instead, I waited. The next morning, I got up before her, moving through the house on autopilot. My mind was already working on a plan, though I wasn't fully aware of it yet. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the dining table, staring out the window at Dan's house. His car was in the driveway, the curtains drawn tightly over the windows. I wondered if Rebecca had been inside the night before, laughing, touching, kissing him. By the time Rebecca woke up, I had already made my decision. If she was going to betray me, I was going to catch her in the act. I wasn't the kind of man who jumped to conclusions or acted on impulse. I needed evidence, undeniable, irrefutable evidence. The first step was subtle. I bought a few small, discreet cameras online and waited for them to arrive. In the meantime, I started paying closer attention to Rebecca's behavior. I watched her texts out of the corner of my eye, noted the times she left the house and the excuses she gave. She was careful, I'll give her that. But not careful enough. 2 days later, the cameras arrived. I installed them while Rebecca was out running errands. I knew the spots to choose: the living room, the hallway leading to the front door, and, of course, our bedroom. The cameras were small enough to blend into the background, and I made sure to test them thoroughly. By the time I was done, I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. That evening, I sat across from Rebecca at the dinner table, watching her as she scrolled through her phone between bites of salad. She barely looked up, muttering something about work being stressful. I nodded, feigning interest, all the while thinking about the cameras I'd hidden. The next few days were a waiting game. I kept up appearances, acting as though nothing had changed, even as my stomach churned with anticipation. Rebecca, for her part, seemed none the wiser. She still smiled at her phone when she thought I wasn't looking, still left the house in her best dress on. Gym nights! And then, finally, it happened. The cameras caught her sneaking Dan into our house one afternoon, while I was at work. Watching the footage later that night, my heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. There she was, laughing softly as she led him up the stairs to our bedroom, her hand lingering on his arm. I paused the video, my hand trembling over the mouse. The image of her betrayal was burned into my mind, but instead of anger, I felt something colder, sharper: determination. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The footage replayed in my head long after I'd closed the laptop. There was no ambiguity, no room for excuses. Rebecca had brought Dan into our home, into our bed. It wasn't a fleeting mistake, or an emotional lapse. This was deliberate, calculated, and ongoing. And I was going to make sure they both faced the consequences. The next day at work was a blur. My colleagues noticed I was quieter than usual, but I waved off their concern with some excuse about being tired. Inside, I was seething, my anger simmering just beneath the surface. Every time I thought about Dan's smug face and Rebecca's laughter, it felt like a fresh wound. But I couldn't afford to lose control, not yet. That evening, I watched Rebecca closely. She acted like everything was fine, greeting me with a smile when I walked through the door. She asked about my day, even kissed me on the cheek. The sheer audacity of her betrayal made my stomach turn. I nodded along, pretending to listen to her chatter about errands and her plans for the week. Meanwhile, my mind was racing, piecing together the next steps of my plan. I waited until she went to bed before pulling out my laptop again. It wasn't enough to catch her in the act. I needed to take things a step further. I needed to break their little bubble of infidelity in the most spectacular way possible. That's when the idea hit me. Dan's wife, Lisa? Lisa was the epitome of the perfect suburban mom, always organizing bake sales, hosting PTA meetings, and tending to her garden. She and Dan seemed like the picture-perfect couple, and I'd always liked her. She was kind, friendly, and had even babysat our kids a few times. The thought of her being dragged into this mess made me feel a pang of guilt, but I quickly pushed it aside. Lisa deserved to know the truth, and she deserved to see it with her own eyes. I spent hours that night compiling the evidence. I clipped segments of the footage from the hidden cameras, careful to choose moments that left no room for doubt. Rebecca and Dan embracing at the front door. Her leading him upstairs. The two of them tangled together on our bed. It was painful to watch, but I forced myself to go through every second, ensuring the videos were clear and damning. Once I had everything ready, I created an anonymous email account. I drafted a short, to-the-point message. Lisa, I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this, but you deserve to know the truth. Your husband, Dan, has been having an affair with my wife, Rebecca. The proof is attached. Please don't ignore this. I wouldn't want to know if I were in your shoes. I attached the videos, double-checked everything, and hovered over the send button. My finger hesitated for a moment, but then I thought about Dan smugly walking into my home and Rebecca's laughter echoing through the walls. With a deep breath, I clicked send. The email went out at exactly 2:13 a.m. There was no turning back now. The next morning, Rebecca was her usual self, sipping coffee at the kitchen table and scrolling through her phone. I couldn't help but wonder how much longer her casual routine would last. Would Lisa confront Dan immediately? Would she wait and gather her own evidence? I had no way of knowing, but the thought of the ticking time bomb I'd set in motion gave me a sense of grim satisfaction. That evening, Rebecca went out again. "Dinner with the girls?" she'd said, flashing me her usual carefree smile. I nodded, pretending to believe her. As soon as her car pulled out of the driveway, I checked the cameras. Sure enough, 20 minutes later, Dan's car rolled up. He parked a block away, the coward, and strolled up to the house as if he owned the place. Watching him enter our home felt like a slap in the face, but I knew I had to stay calm. I didn't watch the footage that night. I already knew what it would show, and I didn't need to torture myself any further. Instead, I poured myself a drink and waited. My phone sat on the counter, silent and still, but I couldn't stop staring at it. Would Lisa respond? Would she believe me? Finally, at 11:47 p.m., my phone buzzed. A single notification lit up the screen, a reply to my anonymous email. My heart pounded as I opened the message. "Whoever you are, thank you. I suspected something was wrong, but this. I had no idea. I'll handle this. You'll never hear from me again." That was it. No name, no follow-up questions. Just a promise to handle this. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Lisa knew. And if I knew anything about her, she wouldn't let Dan off easy. The following days passed in tense anticipation. Rebecca carried on as if nothing had changed, but I noticed subtle shifts in her behavior. She checked her phone more frequently, her expression flickering with unease whenever she read a new message. At one point I caught her staring out the window, her brow furrowed as though she were deep in thought. I said nothing, keeping my mask firmly in place. Then, 2 nights later, it happened. Dan stopped coming around. Rebecca paced the living room, her phone clutched tightly in her hand, frustration etched across her face. I could tell she was texting him, but there were no responses. Something had changed. Little did she know, the unraveling had only just begun. Dan's absence in the days that followed was palpable, even without Rebecca saying a word. She didn't have to. Her frustration radiated from her in waves, and I could see it in every little thing she did. The way she paced the house when she thought I wasn't looking. The way her fingers tapped against her phone screen, frantically typing out messages I knew were going unanswered. And the way she stared out the window as if willing Dan to appear. She didn't talk much that week. Not to me, not to the kids, not even to the friends she so often gossiped with. Her usual sharpness was dulled, replaced by a nervous energy she couldn't seem to shake. I kept my head down, playing the role of the unsuspecting husband, but inside, I was savoring every moment of her unraveling. The first real crack in her composure came one evening when she was sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at her phone. I just walked in from work, tired but oddly satisfied, knowing that Lisa had likely pulled the rug out from under Dan's feet. Rebecca didn't even glance up when I entered. "Tough day?" I asked casually, grabbing a beer from the fridge. She flinched, as if she'd forgotten I was there. "What? Oh, yeah? Work's been busy." Her voice was hollow, and the forced smile she gave me was unconvincing. I nodded, taking a long sip of my beer. "Anything I can help with?" "No," she snapped, then caught herself. No, it's fine. Just stressed, that's all." I let the conversation drop, pretending to accept her half-hearted explanation. But as I watched her fidget in her chair, I knew she was grappling with something far bigger than work stress. And I had no intention of making it easier for her. The next day, I decided it was time to escalate things. Rebecca had been too comfortable for too long, lying to my face while sneaking around behind my back. It was time for her to feel the pressure. Time for her to wonder if her perfect little affair was truly as secret as she thought. That morning, I left for work earlier than usual. Rebecca was still in bed, her phone on the nightstand. I'd been tempted to snoop through it before, but something told me that today wasn't the day for subtlety. Instead, I left a note on the kitchen counter, written in my neatest handwriting. I know. It wasn't much, just 2 words, but they carried enough weight to leave her guessing. I placed the note where she couldn't miss it, right next to the coffee maker, and left the house without another word. All day, I waited for the call or text that I knew would come. Sure enough, my phone buzzed around lunchtime. It was a text from Rebecca. "What does this mean?" I didn't reply. Instead, I let her stew in her own paranoia, imagining all the ways I might have discovered her secret. Did I know about Dan? Did I know about the affair? Or was I referring to something else entirely? The beauty of it was that she had no way of knowing. When I finally got home that evening, the note was gone. Rebecca was in the living room, pretending to read a book, but the tension in her posture was unmistakable. Her eyes flicked up to meet mine as I walked in, searching for something, an answer, maybe, or a hint of what I knew. "How was work?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Fine," I said, shrugging. I kept my tone casual, as though I didn't notice the way her hands trembled as she turned the page of her book. Did you leave a note this morning?" she asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. I tilted my head, feigning confusion. "A note? What kind of note?" Rebecca hesitated, clearly debating whether to press the issue. "Nothing," she said finally, shaking her head. "Never mind." Her reaction told me everything I needed to know. The note had worked. She was on edge, unsure of how much I knew and what I planned to do about it. And the longer I kept her in the dark, the more that uncertainty would eat away at her. But I wasn't done yet. That night, while she was in the shower, I accessed the hidden camera footage from earlier in the week. There was no new activity, of course, not since Dan had gone radio silent. But that wasn't the point. I clipped together a few choice moments from her previous rendezvous with him, focusing on the parts where her face was most visible. Then I uploaded the clips to a secure folder on a cloud account, making sure they were easily accessible. My next step was simple. I sent her the link. The email was anonymous, just like the one I'd sent to Lisa. No subject line, no message. Just a link to the folder containing the videos. I scheduled the email to send at 11 p.m., knowing she'd already be in bed by then. When she checked her phone in the morning, it would be the first thing she saw. Sure enough, the next morning, Rebecca was pale and jittery. She barely said a word as she rushed out the door, mumbling something about an early meeting. I didn't stop her. I just watched her leave, a cold smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. The silence was deafening now, and I knew it wouldn't last much longer. Rebecca's perfect little world was starting to crumble, and I was the one holding the sledgehammer. By the time Rebecca came home that evening, I could tell something was different. Her usual confidence was gone, replaced by a nervous energy that made her movements jerky and unnatural. She avoided looking at me as she dropped her bag by the door and headed straight to the kitchen, muttering something about needing water. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what was running through her mind, the email. I had watched her check her phone that morning, her face pale as she stared at the screen, probably reading and rereading the anonymous message with the damning link. I imagined her fingers trembling as she clicked it, her eyes widening as she realized what it contained. Her affair with Dan, captured in crisp, undeniable detail. She didn't know who had sent it or why, but the paranoia I had planted was working its magic. "Long day?" I asked as I joined her in the kitchen, my tone casual. Rebecca jumped slightly, turning to face me with a strained smile. Yeah? Just a lot going on at work." I nodded, pretending to believe her. "Anything I can help with?" "No," she said quickly, a little too quickly. "Just normal work stuff." "All right," I said, shrugging. "Let me know if you need anything." Her eyes lingered on me for a moment, as if searching for some sign that I knew more than I was letting on. I kept my expression neutral, giving her nothing to work with. It was a delicate game, and I wasn't about to tip my hand just yet. As the evening wore on, Rebecca grew increasingly restless. She paced the house, checked her phone obsessively, and jumped at every notification. I noticed her stepping outside to take a call at one point, her voice low and hurried. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but I could guess. She was trying to reach Dan. But Dan wasn't answering. Not anymore. Lisa had seen to that. I spent the next few days watching Rebecca unravel. She was on edge constantly, snapping at the kids over small things and retreating to our bedroom for long stretches of time. She claimed she wasn't feeling well, blaming it on stress from work, but I knew better. She was spiraling, and I was content to let her. By the weekend, the cracks in her facade were impossible to ignore. She was barely eating, her hair was unkempt, and the dark circles under her eyes made her look like a shadow of the woman I'd married. It was clear that she was terrified, not just of me, but of the entire situation she'd created. And then, on Sunday evening, the dam finally broke. I was in the living room, pretending to read a book, when Rebecca walked in. She stood in the doorway for a moment, fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. Her face was pale, and her eyes darted around the room as if she were searching for an escape route. Finally she spoke. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice shaky. I set the book down and leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. "Sure. What's on your mind?" Rebecca hesitated, her hands twisting together nervously. I've been feeling really overwhelmed lately. There's a lot going on, and I feel like I've been distracted." "Distracted?" I repeated, raising an eyebrow. "By what?" She flinched at the question, her face crumpling for a brief moment before she regained her composure. "Work," she said quickly. "And other things." "Other things?" I echoed, letting the words hang in the air. Rebecca shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my gaze. I feel like we've been distant lately, and I wanted to talk about how we can fix that." I stared at her, wondering how long she'd keep dancing around the issue. She was trying to test the waters, trying to gauge how much I knew without giving anything away. But I wasn't going to make it that easy for her. "Distant," I said finally. "Yeah, I've noticed that too." Her eyes flicked up to meet mine, a flicker of hope lighting in them. "You have?" "Sure," I said, leaning forward slightly. "In fact, I've noticed a lot of things lately." Rebecca froze, her breath hitching. "What do you mean?" I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. "You know exactly what I mean, Rebecca." Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought she might break down entirely. But then she straightened up, her expression hardening. "You've been snooping, haven't you?" she accused, her voice rising. "You've been spying on me." "I don't have to spy on you," I said calmly, though my heart was pounding in my chest. "You've been sloppy, Rebecca. Sloppy and careless." Her mouth opened and closed, no words coming out. Finally, she managed to whisper, "What do you know?" "Enough," I said, my voice sharp. "Enough to know that this." I gestured around the room. "This marriage, this life we've built, doesn't mean a damn thing to you anymore." "That's not true," she said quickly, tears welling up in her eyes. "I love you, I swear." Don't," I snapped, cutting her off. "Don't you dare sit there and lie to my face, Rebecca. I've seen the videos. I know about Dan. I know everything." The color drained from her face, and she staggered back a step as if I'd struck her. Her lips trembled, but no sound came out. For the first time in weeks, she looked completely and utterly defeated. I stood up, towering over her as I delivered the final blow. "You think I'm the fool in this situation? You have no idea what I'm capable of." Rebecca sank into the nearest chair, burying her face in her hands as sobs racked her body. I didn't move to comfort her. This was just the beginning. The house was quiet in the days that followed, but it wasn't the kind of silence I used to cherish. It was heavy, oppressive, as if every room was weighed down by the fallout of our confrontation. Rebecca moved through the house like a ghost, her usual confidence replaced by a fragile, jittery demeanor. She barely spoke to me, and when she did, her words were cautious, measured, as though she feared saying the wrong thing might set off a new wave of consequences. I, on the other hand, felt a strange sense of calm. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't walking on eggshells, wondering what was going on behind my back. I knew everything. And I was in control now. Rebecca had tried once to apologize, cornering me in the kitchen the morning after our argument. She'd looked disheveled, her eyes red from crying, her voice trembling as she said, "We need to talk." "I don't think we do," I'd replied coldly, brushing past her on my way to the coffee maker. "Please," she'd insisted, grabbing my arm. "I made a mistake, okay? A terrible mistake. But I love you, and I want to fix this. We can fix this." I'd stared at her for a long moment, the weight of her betrayal settling heavily on my chest. "You think this can be fixed?" I'd asked, my voice low but cutting. "You think you can sleep with the neighbor, lie to my face for months, and then just say oops and we'll go back to normal?" Rebecca had flinched at my words, her eyes filling with tears. "It wasn't like that," she'd whispered. "No?" I'd countered, taking a step closer. "Then tell me, what was it like? Enlighten me, Rebecca." She hadn't answered, just looked away, her shoulders slumping in defeat. I'd left her there, retreating to my office without another word. Now, as I sat at my desk reviewing emails for work, I replayed that moment in my mind, feeling the same mix of anger and grim satisfaction. Rebecca's perfect little world was crumbling, and I wasn't going to lift a finger to stop it. Later that evening, as I was putting the kids to bed, I noticed something odd. Rebecca wasn't in her usual spot in the living room, scrolling through her phone or pretending to read a book. I checked the kitchen, the backyard, even the bedroom, but she was nowhere to be found. Finally, I heard the faint hum of her voice coming from the garage. I paused outside the door, listening. She was on the phone. "I don't know what to do," she was saying, her voice trembling. "He knows, Dan. He knows everything." Dan. Just hearing his name made my blood boil, but I forced myself to stay calm, straining to catch the rest of the conversation. "I can't. He hasn't said anything about the email, but I know he saw it. He's been so cold, so distant." Her voice broke, and I could hear her taking a shaky breath. "I think he's planning something, Dan. I can feel it." Good, I thought to myself. Let her feel it. Let her wonder what's coming next. I slipped away before she could notice me, retreating to the bedroom to process what I just heard. She was still in contact with Dan, even after everything that had happened. I couldn't say I was surprised, but it confirmed something I'd been suspecting. She wasn't ready to give him up. Not yet. The next day, I made my move. I waited until Rebecca was out of the house. She'd claimed she had errands to run, though I had no doubt she'd find a way to slip away and talk to Dan. Once she was gone, I set to work. The cameras were still in place, and I reviewed the footage from the past few days, looking for anything I might have missed. Sure enough, there were moments that stood out. Rebecca pacing the house, muttering under her breath, glancing at her phone as if willing it to ring. She was unraveling, and it was only a matter of time before she made a mistake. But I wasn't going to wait for her to slip up. I had plans of my own. That afternoon, I reached out to Lisa again. I hadn't heard from her since she replied to my email, but I figured she'd want an update. I drafted a short message. "Lisa, I thought you'd like to know that Rebecca is still in contact with Dan. If you're planning to take action, now might be the time. Let me know if you need anything." It didn't take long for her to reply. Her response was short but firm. "Thank you. I've already filed for divorce. Dan won't know what hit him." A small smile tugged at the corners of my mouth. Lisa wasn't messing around, and neither was I. That evening, I noticed Rebecca's behavior shift again. She seemed even more anxious than before, her eyes darting toward her phone every few minutes. I wondered if Dan had finally told her about Lisa's plans, or if he'd simply stopped responding altogether. Either way, it was clear that she was losing control, and I couldn't help but feel a twisted sense of satisfaction. For years, I'd been the steady, dependable one in our marriage, the one who fixed problems and kept everything running smoothly. But now I was the one holding all the cards. And as Rebecca's house of lies continued to collapse around her, I knew one thing for certain: this was far from over. Rebecca's unraveling was now in full swing. Over the next few days, she seemed to drift further into a state of barely concealed panic. Her usual facade, poised, in control, was shattered. I watched her like a hawk, noting every small crack in her mask. She hardly ate, spent hours locked in the bedroom or pacing the living room, and always kept her phone within arm's reach, as though it were her only lifeline. For me, it was like watching a dam buckle under pressure, each tiny fracture widening until the whole structure threatened to collapse. By midweek, I noticed her phone calls were becoming more frequent, her hushed tones filled with urgency. She'd slip into the garage or out onto the back porch whenever she thought I wasn't paying attention. But I was. I always was. One evening, after she'd locked herself in the bedroom with her phone again, I quietly accessed the hidden camera footage from the last few days. Sure enough, Rebecca had been making regular calls to Dan. I could only imagine the content of their conversations, likely a mix of panicked pleading and mutual strategizing as they tried to figure out what to do next. What they didn't realize, of course, was that Dan's situation had already been resolved. Lisa wasn't the type to let things slide. When she told me she'd filed for divorce, I knew she'd meant it. A quick search of public records confirmed it. The papers were filed, and Dan had been served. If the angry texts Rebecca was furiously typing to him were any indication, the news had hit him hard. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But Rebecca's misery wasn't enough for me, not yet. I wanted her to feel the full weight of what she'd done, to know that every ounce of this fallout was a direct consequence of her actions. That's when I decided it was time for another push. The following morning, I left another note for her. This time, I kept it even simpler than the first. "He's gone. What now?" I placed it on her pillow, knowing she'd see it when she woke up. Then I headed out for work, wondering how long it would take for the note to send her spiraling. Sure enough, by lunchtime, my phone buzzed with a text from her. "What does this mean? Please, just talk to me." I ignored it, as I had the last time. She sent another text an hour later. "I don't understand what you're trying to do. Can we please talk about this?" Still, I said nothing. Rebecca was clearly grasping at straws now, desperate for answers but terrified of what I might reveal if she pushed too hard. I let her stew, keeping my focus on work while she unraveled further. When I got home that evening, she was waiting for me in the living room, her face pale and drawn. The note was crumpled in her hand, and she looked like she hadn't slept in days. As soon as I walked in, she stood up, her movements jerky and unsteady. "What's going on?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "Why are you doing this?" I raised an eyebrow, feigning confusion. "Doing what?" "This," she said, holding up the note. "Leaving these messages. Watching me like a hawk, acting like you know something but refusing to just come out and say it." "I don't know what you're talking about," I said calmly, setting my bag down on the counter. "I haven't done anything." "Don't lie to me," she snapped, her voice rising. "I know you've been. I don't know, snooping, spying, whatever it is you've been doing. Just tell me what you want." I turned to face her, my expression carefully blank. "What I want," I repeated. "I want my wife back. I want the woman I married, the woman who cared about this family and respected our marriage. But I think we both know that woman's long gone." Rebecca's face crumpled, and for a moment she looked like she might collapse. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she whispered, sinking onto the couch. "I didn't mean for things to go this far." I folded my arms, watching her. "Go this far? You mean the affair? Or losing Dan?" Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. "What? You think I don't know what's going on?" I asked, my tone cold. "I've known for weeks, Rebecca. I've seen the texts, the phone calls, the emails. I've seen the footage." "Footage?" she repeated, her voice trembling. I nodded. "That's right. I've been watching you. Every lie, every betrayal, it's all on tape. And guess what? Dan's wife knows too. Lisa's filed for divorce, which means your little fling is over. Rebecca's face went pale, and she clutched the arm of the couch as though she might faint. You told her? She whispered. I didn't have to, I said, leaning closer. She deserved to know, just like I did. For a long moment, Rebecca didn't say anything. She just stared at me, her expression a mix of shock, anger, and something else, fear. Finally, she managed to choke out, "What are you going to do?" I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "What am I going to do?" "Nothing. You've already done it all for me." And with that, I walked out of the room, leaving Rebecca to sit in the wreckage of the life she'd destroyed. The morning after our confrontation, Rebecca was still sitting on the couch when I walked into the living room. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her hair disheveled, and the tension in her posture spoke volumes. She had stayed there all night, judging by the untouched blanket I kept draped over the back of the couch. She didn't acknowledge me at first, her eyes fixed on some point in the distance. It was a far cry from the confident woman who used to breeze through the mornings without so much as a wrinkle in her blouse. Now, she looked like a prisoner awaiting sentencing. As I made my coffee, I could feel her gaze flicking toward me, though she didn't say anything. I wasn't in the mood to speak, and even if I were, there wasn't much left to say. I'd exposed the affair, dismantled her relationship with Dan, and forced her to confront the reality of her actions. If she wanted to save face, or whatever scraps of dignity she had left, it was up to her to initiate the conversation. She finally broke the silence as I was pouring the last of the coffee into my mug. "Do the kids know?" Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, but the question hung heavy in the air. I turned to face her, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make her squirm. "No," I said simply. "Not yet." Rebecca visibly relaxed, but the relief was short-lived. "Are you going to tell them?" she asked, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "That depends," I replied, my tone measured. "Are you planning to tell them yourself?" Her face crumpled at the thought, and she looked away, shaking her head. "They don't deserve to be dragged into this." "No," I said coldly. "They don't. But you should have thought about that before you brought another man into our home." Rebecca flinched as if I'd slapped her, and for a moment, I almost felt guilty. Almost. But then I remembered the nights I'd spent lying awake, wondering why my wife had become a stranger. The months I'd spent watching her deceive me, pretending everything was fine while she tore apart our family. Whatever guilt she felt now was a fraction of what she deserved. The rest of the morning passed in strained silence. Rebecca retreated to the bedroom, shutting the door behind her, and I busied myself with chores to keep my mind from spiraling. But no matter how many times I scrubbed the kitchen counter or folded the laundry, the weight of the situation lingered, pressing down on me like a storm cloud. By mid-afternoon, I noticed Rebecca's behavior shift again. She emerged from the bedroom, her face pale but determined, and began moving through the house with a sense of purpose. At first, I thought she might be packing her things, preparing to leave, but then I noticed her focus was on cleaning. She scrubbed the floors, organized the closets, and even went through the pantry, discarding expired items. It was as if she were trying to erase her guilt through sheer domestic labor. I watched her silently, curious to see how long the act would last. She didn't speak to me, didn't meet my eyes, but her movements were frantic, almost manic. I could tell she was teetering on the edge of a breakdown, and I wondered how much more pressure she could take before she finally cracked. The breaking point came later that evening. I was in the living room, pretending to watch TV, when Rebecca walked in. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, her hands clenched at her sides, before finally stepping forward. Her voice was trembling as she spoke. I can't do this anymore," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I can't take the silence, the tension. I know I screwed up, okay? I know I ruined everything, but I can't keep living like this." I didn't respond right away, letting her words hang in the air. When I finally looked at her, my expression was calm, detached. "What do you want me to say, Rebecca? That it's all forgiven?" That we'll pretend none of this ever happened? No, she said quickly, tears streaming down her face. I want to fix it. I want to fix us. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Fix us? There's no fixing this, Rebecca. You didn't just break my trust, you annihilated it. And the worst part is, you didn't just betray me. You betrayed our family. I know, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I know I can't take it back, but I'm begging you to give me a chance to make things right. I shook my head, the bitterness rising in my chest. You don't get to beg for a second chance after everything you've done. You made your choices, and now you have to live with the consequences. Rebecca collapsed onto the couch, sobbing into her hands. For the first time, I saw her as something other than my wife, as a deeply flawed, deeply selfish person who had chosen her own desires over the people who depended on her. I don't know what to do, she cried, her voice muffled. I don't know how to fix this. I leaned back in my chair, studying her for a long moment. Maybe, I said slowly, it's time for you to stop thinking about what you want. Maybe it's time to think about the people you hurt. She looked up at me, her tear-streaked face full of desperation. But I didn't feel sympathy. Not anymore. Figure it out, Rebecca, I said, my voice cold. Because I'm done cleaning up your messes. The days following Rebecca's meltdown were eerily quiet. She avoided me as much as possible, and when she did speak, her words were measured and careful, as though she feared saying something that would push me further away. Not that it mattered, my mind was already made up. I'd been patient, deliberate, and methodical in bringing this situation to light, but I knew it was time to start thinking about the next step, my own future. For all her tears and apologies, Rebecca hadn't truly accepted responsibility. Her guilt was real, but it wasn't enough to undo the damage she'd caused. And no amount of forced conversations or attempts at reconciliation could erase the image of her with Dan, sneaking him into our home like a thief in the night. The tipping point came one Saturday afternoon. Rebecca had gone out again, this time claiming she needed space to think. The words felt hollow, as they always did now, but I let her leave without a word. I knew where this was heading. Her guilt and desperation were eating her alive, and sooner or later, she'd either break entirely or find a way to justify her actions. I wasn't sticking around to find out which. After she left, I sat down at my desk and began drafting a plan. I'd already gathered every shred of evidence I needed to protect myself, the videos, the emails, the phone records. I documented everything in meticulous detail, leaving no room for doubt. If Rebecca thought she could twist the narrative, she was sorely mistaken. I wasn't going to let her play the victim. The kids were my priority. I'd stayed quiet for their sake, keeping the tension between Rebecca and me behind closed doors. But the longer this dragged on, the more I worried about how it was affecting them. They were smart, too smart to miss the strained silences and hushed arguments. My oldest, in particular, had started asking questions. Is Mom okay? He'd asked me a few nights ago, his brow furrowed in concern. She seems different. She's fine, I'd replied, forcing a smile. She's just going through a rough patch. It wasn't a lie exactly. But it wasn't the whole truth either. And as I sat at my desk, staring at the growing pile of evidence, I realized I couldn't keep shielding them forever. They deserved stability, and if Rebecca couldn't provide it, I'd make sure they got it elsewhere. That evening, Rebecca came home later than usual. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed, and she looked like she'd been crying. She walked into the living room without a word, collapsing onto the couch with a heavy sigh. For a moment, I considered ignoring her, letting her stew in whatever misery she was carrying. But something about her demeanor made me pause. Rough day? I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Rebecca looked up at me, her expression blank. Dan's gone, she said flatly. I raised an eyebrow. Gone? He moved out, she clarified, her voice hollow. Lisa kicked him out of the house, and he didn't tell me. I found out through one of our mutual friends. Her confession hit me with a strange mix of emotions. Part of me wanted to laugh at the irony, Rebecca, betrayed by the man she'd betrayed me with. But another part of me felt nothing at all, just a cold indifference to the situation she'd created for herself. "And how does that make you feel?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. Rebecca's eyes flashed with something, anger, maybe, or desperation. "How do you think it makes me feel?" she snapped. "I've lost everything. Dan's gone, Lisa's divorcing him, and you hate me." "I don't hate you," I said calmly. "But I don't think I can ever forgive you either." Her shoulders sagged, and she buried her face in her hands. "I don't know how it came to this," she whispered. "I never wanted to hurt anyone." "Didn't you?" I asked, my voice sharp. "Because from where I'm standing, it seems like you made a lot of choices that hurt a lot of people." Rebecca didn't respond. She just sat there, her body shaking with silent sobs. For a moment, I felt a flicker of pity, but it was quickly drowned out by the memory of all the lies, the betrayal, the nights I'd spent wondering where she was while she was with him. The rest of the evening passed in strained silence. Rebecca went to bed early, and I stayed up late, going over my plan again and again in my head. By the time I finally turned in, I knew what I needed to do. The next morning, I started making calls. The first was to my lawyer. I'd been researching divorce attorneys for weeks, narrowing down my options until I found someone with a reputation for being ruthless but fair. The consultation was quick and efficient, and by the time I hung up, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The second call was to a locksmith. If Rebecca was going to spiral, I needed to protect the kids, and myself, from whatever fallout might come next. The locks would be changed by the end of the week, and Rebecca would have no choice but to confront the reality of what she'd done. By the time Rebecca woke up that morning, the wheels were already in motion. She had no idea what was coming, and for the first time in months, I felt like I was in control again. This wasn't revenge. It was justice. And I wasn't going to stop until I saw it through. The locks were changed by Friday morning, and the papers were ready to be served. I had anticipated that Rebecca would crumble under the weight of everything, but I wasn't prepared for just how far she would spiral. Over the past few days, she'd barely eaten, her once sharp gaze now dull and glassy. She floated through the house like a ghost, and though she tried to act normal around the kids, her energy betrayed her. That morning, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, watching the sun filter through the blinds. The kids were still asleep, and Rebecca hadn't emerged from the bedroom yet. I had taken the day off work to finalize everything, and as I sat there, my lawyer's words replayed in my head. "Don't let her manipulate you. Stand firm, especially if she tries to use guilt as leverage. Protect yourself and your children first." When Rebecca finally walked into the room, her appearance was disheveled, her eyes swollen from another sleepless night. She looked at me cautiously, as though she knew I was holding something back. She was right. "We need to talk," I said evenly, motioning for her to sit. Rebecca hesitated, her hand tightening on the back of the chair, but eventually she lowered herself into the seat. "What is it?" she asked, her voice thin. I reached into my bag and pulled out the manila envelope. I placed it on the table between us, the sound of it landing breaking the stillness. Rebecca's eyes flicked to it, her face immediately draining of color. "What is that?" she whispered. "Divorce papers," I said simply. Her breath hitched, and for a moment she just stared at the envelope as if it might explode. Then she looked up at me, her eyes wide with panic. "You're divorcing me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Yes," I said, my tone calm but firm. "It's over, Rebecca." Tears welled up in her eyes as she shook her head. "No," she said, her voice breaking. "It can't be over. We can fix this. I can fix this." "You can't," I said, leaning forward slightly. "You made your choices, and now you have to live with the consequences." "But what about the kids?" she cried, her tears falling freely now. "We can't do this to them. Please think about them." "I am thinking about them," I said sharply. Do you think this is what's best for them? Living in a house filled with lies and resentment? Watching their mother destroy their father's trust? No, Rebecca. The kids deserve better than this. She opened her mouth to argue, but I held up a hand to stop her. I've already spoken to a lawyer, I said. The papers are ready. You'll find everything you need in the envelope. I'm not asking for much, just custody of the kids and the house. You can take whatever you need to start over. Her face twisted in despair. Start over? You're just throwing me away? You threw us away first, I said coldly. Rebecca dissolved into sobs, clutching the edge of the table as though it were the only thing keeping her upright. I stood, unable to watch her any longer. I didn't feel satisfaction or vindication, only a hollow sense of finality. This was the end of a chapter one never wanted to write. That afternoon, the papers were served, and Rebecca's reaction was as volatile as I expected. She swung between anger and pleading, her emotions shifting so quickly it was impossible to keep up. At one point, she accused me of sabotaging her life, of turning Lisa against Dan and ruining everything. You planned this, didn't you? She spat, her eyes blazing with fury. You orchestrated all of it. Dan leaving, Lisa divorcing him, it was all you. I didn't make you cheat, Rebecca, I said calmly. You did that all on your own. Her rage sputtered out as quickly as it had ignited, and she sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. I don't know who I am anymore, she whispered. I've ruined everything. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. By the time the weekend rolled around, Rebecca had packed her things. I'd given her a week to find a place to stay, but she chose to leave sooner, likely unable to bear the tension any longer. Watching her load the last of her bags into her car was surreal. This was the woman I had shared 12 years of my life with, the mother of my children, and yet in that moment she felt like a stranger. As she stood by the driver's side door, she turned to me one last time. I'm sorry, she said, her voice barely audible. For everything. I nodded but didn't speak. Sorry didn't erase the betrayal. Sorry didn't undo the damage. She climbed into the car and drove away without looking back. That night, as I tucked the kids into bed, my oldest asked, Is Mom coming back? I hesitated, my heart aching at the question. She's not going to live here anymore, I said carefully. But you'll still see her. She loves you, and she always will. Do you still love her? He asked. I paused, considering my answer. Finally I said, I love the person she used to be. But sometimes, people change. And that's okay. He seemed to accept that, nodding quietly before drifting off to sleep. As I stood in the doorway, watching him breathe softly, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in months. The storm was over. The pieces of my life were scattered, but they were mine to rebuild. And for the first time in a long time, I was ready to move forward. The first few weeks after Rebecca left were a whirlwind of adjustment. The house felt quieter, almost too quiet, but not in the suffocating way it had during the height of her deception. This silence was peaceful, clean, a blank slate. It wasn't without its challenges, of course. The kids had questions I wasn't always prepared to answer, and there were moments when the weight of everything felt like too much to bear. But every day, I reminded myself that this was a necessary step toward healing. Rebecca and I communicated sparingly, only when it was about the kids. She moved into a small apartment across town, one that, according to our oldest, didn't feel like home. I didn't pry into her new life. It wasn't my business anymore, and honestly, I didn't care. My focus was on the children and the life I was rebuilding for us. The divorce proceedings were smooth, thanks in large part to the airtight case I'd built. Rebecca didn't contest custody. How could she? She knew I had the upper hand, and I think a part of her was too ashamed to fight. She signed the papers without much of a fuss, leaving me the house and primary custody of the kids. I agreed to a reasonable visitation schedule because, despite everything, she was still their mother. And no matter how much she had hurt me, I didn't want to weaponize the kids against her. One afternoon, about a month after Rebecca moved out, Lisa called me. Her divorce from Dan was finalized, and she wanted to thank me again for giving her the evidence she needed to confront him. "You saved me a lot of time and heartache," she said. "And honestly, watching him squirm when I laid everything out was worth every second." We talked for a while, commiserating over the shared betrayal we'd experienced. Lisa mentioned that Dan had tried reaching out to her a few times, begging for forgiveness, but she wasn't having it. "He made his bed," she said. "Now he gets to lie in it, alone." I admired her strength. Lisa was direct, unflinching, and unwavering in her resolve. Talking to her felt like a breath of fresh air, a reminder that I wasn't alone in this. By the time we hung up, I felt lighter, more certain about the path I was on. The first major milestone in our new life came on a quiet Saturday afternoon. The kids and I were in the backyard, working together to clean out the old shed. It was the kind of task Rebecca would have rolled her eyes at, tedious and messy, but to me, it was an act of reclamation. This house, this space, was mine again. As we sorted through the clutter, my youngest found an old photo album buried under a pile of dusty boxes. We sat on the patio, flipping through the pages together, and for the first time in months, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel: gratitude. Gratitude for the memories we'd made, even the ones with Rebecca. Gratitude for the lessons I'd learned, painful as they were. And gratitude for the opportunity to rebuild, to show my kids what resilience looked like. "I think we should start making new memories," my oldest said, his voice thoughtful as he looked at the faded photos of birthdays and holidays past. "I think you're right," I replied, ruffling his hair. "What do you say we take a trip this summer? Just the three of us." The kids lit up at the suggestion, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I saw genuine joy in their eyes. It was a small moment, but it felt monumental, a step forward. Rebecca called one evening, about 2 months after the divorce was finalized. Her voice was hesitant, uncertain, as if she wasn't sure she had the right to ask for my time. "I just wanted to check in," she said. "See how the kids are doing." "They're fine," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "They're adjusting." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally she spoke. "I'm trying to figure things out," she said quietly. "I've been going to therapy, trying to understand why I did what I did." "That's good," I said, not unkindly. "I hope it helps." "Do you think you'll ever forgive me?" she asked, her voice small. I thought about her question for a long moment. Forgiveness had seemed impossible at first, but now, with time and distance, I could feel the edges of my anger softening. Still, forgiveness didn't mean reconciliation, and it didn't mean forgetting. "Maybe," I said finally. "But not for your sake. For mine." Rebecca didn't argue or plead. She just thanked me and hung up, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I sat on the porch for a while after that, staring at the stars and wondering what the future would look like. It wasn't clear yet, but for the first time in months, I felt hopeful. Life didn't magically fix itself after the divorce. There were still hard days, moments of doubt, and nights when I lay awake, wondering what I could have done differently. But slowly, I began to heal. The kids and I fell into a new routine, one built on honesty, openness, and mutual respect. And as time passed, I realized that the betrayal I'd endured didn't define me. It was a chapter, a painful, messy chapter, but it wasn't the whole story. I'm not sure where Rebecca's journey will take her, and truthfully, I don't care. My focus is on my kids, on myself, and on the life we're building together. And if there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's this: betrayal doesn't break you. It refines you. It strips away the illusions, the lies, and the excuses, leaving you with the raw, unfiltered truth. And the truth is this: I'm stronger than I ever knew.